All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Deviant Mind. This is one of your hosts, Dominika.
And I'm Christopher.
And I hope you enjoyed our massive, long, almost 2 hour last episode on part two of Columbine. Today is going to be our last episode on Columbine and talking a little bit about the aftermath and what has happened since then.
Yes.
So I guess when we talk about the aftermath, we can talk again. This was in 1999.
Yeah.
On April 20th, and the media had gone completely crazy. So the interesting thing about Columbine is that it's in unincorporated territory. And so there isn't that much government there. It's provided by Jefferson County, and those offices, the governmental offices, are located in Golden, which is about 15 to 20 minutes away. And so the local community was really held together by a lot of its religious institutions. And so during the healing process that happened after, they were front and center. So churches were open to anyone who needed comfort. Youth groups at said churches were meeting daily. That the kind of media response that came out of that was that again, it was patriotic, religious, and unified. And this is to Columbine as a community.
Yeah.
And it's in opposition to the evil perpetrated by Harris and Klebold. And, you know, there was a huge evangelical community there, which we kind of touched upon last week. And they really saw this as a battle between good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
So very black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of kept marketing it. And I want to say marketing because for you listeners who maybe are not in the United States, the evangelical community is constantly trying to find converts, and they're constantly marketing to try to change. And I think this is going to be kind of a controversial topic, but trying to change the United States from a kind of a secular country to more of a religious one.
Yes.
And
there seems to be this weird connection between gun control, gun rights, NRA, and the religious communities. Some, not all, but there seems to be, especially in the South, there's kind of like an alliance where they equate the right to bear arms, right? And it's bear arms, not like bear a gun, not like protect yourself. Either way, it's almost God-given. It's a God-given right. So like those two kind of intertwine later and in response to this horrible event. Like, hey, it's not the guns, we were meant to have these guns. It's like this higher authority.
Exactly. And which I think we kind of have done this, but to put Columbine in context, it was known as the largest mass murder in the United States between the Oklahoma City bombing in 1996 and the attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Because remember, this was in 1999. And like nobody had really seen anything quite like this in a very long time. And so, of course, when things like this happen, there was huge controversies. So there was issues with people took with the SWAT teams and the decisions made by Jefferson County Sheriff Stone. That was a lot with the media and with the residents.
Yes. Well, one of the issues was, they say the media got there actually before all the other cops. Granted, there were the two cops that we mentioned, I think, in part one. But the media ultimately got there, and it came to a point where media trucks were actually in the way of the paramedics. Like they had to shift over. So as was the case also in Waco, you just had the media there. And I was able to watch this documentary about how the media handled Columbine. And it's fascinating. You have anchors basically saying they were there. They felt really awkward interviewing the children, the students who were like fleeing and walking away, right? Walking to their families, walking to the parking lots, and just hounding them with questions, right? And you get these very emotional, like on the spot, traumatic responses where they're not thinking clearly. And then
Right.
they'll interview the parents. And anchors were like, it's very hard. And in fact, there was this one anchor who was like, I'd like to stop. Like, I feel I don't want to keep pressing. And the network said, no, please stay there. You got to stay there. You got to cover that. Everyone else is there. So there was a tremendous pressure within the media to bombard and try to find out what's going on. And then before you know it, it becomes less about the victims and what the children are going through. And now Time Magazine, all the other media is, who are these shooters? Who are Dylan and Eric? So now we're starting to unintentionally, perhaps, but it also sells papers, it gets viewers, dive into the killers rather than how this event even affected other people and what could we, solutions to this. Rather than focusing on that, the media is like, we got to keep this going. This is great for our news cycle.
Which also begins the glorification of these mass murder shooters. And it's, also goes into like, why did they do what they do? Which is, there was the accusations about the bullying and harassment of students at Columbine High School by the athletes and how it couldn't be stopped. And then, of course, you always have to look at the parents, right? So the parents of Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris were completely vilified, both in the media and in the community.
Yeah.
And along with this vilification, of course, came lawsuits. The parents of Isaiah Scholes filed suits against the Klebolds and the Harrises, the school district, and the sheriff's office for negligence, to provide sufficient security, and the fact that the community and the police did not act on the warning signs of Harris's and Klebold's violent attitudes. But again, very tricky because we have the First Amendment here. And just because you say something online, there's this whole question about inciting violence, which they're not necessarily inciting violence of other people. They're just putting this horrifying violence to consciousness.
But but people also went to the authorities saying, "Hey, they're building pipe bombs."
Right.
And they never searched. So to me, they are worthy of a lawsuit more than the parents.
Yeah. And then, of course, which is exactly what the Klebolds and the Harrises did. They sued the sheriff's department.
Yeah.
But they sued them over the ownership of their son's videotapes. So they wanted to get those videotapes back. And then, of course, the sheriff's department was being sued by numerous complainants, including the parents of Daniel Rarbo, said that he was actually not shot by Klebold, but by law enforcement fire, which we talked about in the past episode. But it did turn out that he was, in fact, shot by Klebold. And also the wife of Dave Sanders, who was the murderer, she sued them over the delay in allowing emergency medical services personnel to minister to her husband's wounds because he actually bled to death.
Good for her.
So if the emergency medical services had been able to get there in time, he would have survived. And then also the parents of the victims sued the three persons who procured weapons for Harris and Klebold as well, because they were not of age.
Yeah. And the eldest, the young male, I'm blanking on his name, got 60 years.
For getting weapons for them?
Correct. Yeah.
Now, also, there was, again, controversies over who was in charge of the memorial service. So there was a lot of liberal Protestant sects that were not happy about the fact that Reverend Jerry Nelson was in charge of the memorial service, and he definitely had some veiled anti Semitism in his sermon during
Mm-hmm.
the memorial service.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's also the myth that Cassie Bernall was murdered because she said she believed in God.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of caught fire in the community as well, like we had talked about. And so there was a lot of issues with the religious sects that were in Columbine at the time. And up to this point, Columbine, and I think this is probably now since we've had so many more mass shootings, I think this book was written,
I
was,
gotta ask you offhand,
yes,
do you
go ahead.
know if I forget the memorial it was is for everyone, correct? Like no victim had their own individual memorial. Is that correct?
I believe it was one big memorial
Okay.
from my understanding.
Yeah.
Although uh I think kids had funerals together, but
Okay.
I think the memorial for the whole thing
Right.
was
For the whole. Okay.
yeah. And then as we talked about before, the media just kept on going and going. And so there was pundits, and this is where we get into the whole video games and television violence and religious hatred, political
Yes.
liberalism, lack of
Yes.
values, rock and roll music, goth
Yeah.
youth subculture.
Yes.
They even got into Jewish conspiracy theories, and
It's
it
interesting how much that keeps coming up, and it's ironic because these guys were Eric was a Nazi sympathizer.
yeah,
I remember when the towers fell down, there were so many rumors about how Israel and Jews were behind it, that no Jews actually showed up to the towers that day. Like all these insane rumors. But the other thing I took away from this media doc about Columbine was that uh, just as today, we flash forward all these years later, and CNN recently had a Trump town hall, and Christian Amanpour came out recently and said, this was just a complete circus show. Like it was just to get viewers, try to get the Fox viewers. And so she spoke out. So that's what was interesting about this documentary, was because you hear anchors speaking out about the pressure constantly to just be there, set up at Columbine. And sometimes they would interview the same people. And
right.
so some anchors were just like, we were really disappointed in how we were pushed. And that was something they didn't want to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
And now that's become the norm, because with every
right.
school shooting that happens, it's the same thing, rinse and repeat. Like the Uvalde, which is the one in Connecticut, um, the one in Florida. Like every school shooting, it's the same thing. Like you see the photos of the traumatized kids, you see
Right.
kids talking on camera right as it's happening. Like it hasn't changed in 30
It
years.
hasn't.
It's almost like the textbook now. And I almost feel like, you're causing those children even more, what is it called? Not notoriety, but almost more trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because now you're beaming their trauma to like
Mm-hmm.
millions and millions of households in perpetuity. So whenever that kid goes on the internet and looks up their name, there they are in the most horrible time of their lives. And at the same time, you're giving the shooter exactly what they want, which
Yeah.
is to see that pain and the violence. And, I always find it interesting, kind of going into the social justice kind of aspect of it, is that outside of the shooters who kill themselves, they tend to survive. They get taken away by the cops,
Yeah.
which I always find fascinating, that the cops don't gun them down like they gun other people down in this country.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times these shooters are white and they're male. That's
Yeah.
and what is it with the white males of this country that they are so angry that they come to this? And
Yeah.
we had talked about Eric and his mental issues that might have been helped along by the use of antidepressants.
Yeah.
which I actually was speaking to a friend of mine who had said that she had seen kids on those medication and the kind of rages
Mhm.
that they would go through.
Mhm.
And that she had seen a lot of parents decide to take their kids off of those medications because of the rage issue.
Sure. I
And
mean,
so,
again, there wasn't much, uh, they didn't do the proper tests and studies that they should have uh, on the interaction between these pharmaceuticals and the teenagers and these young minds that are taking them. There are also some good things that did come from this tragedy, and that is survivors' parents, victims' parents, rather, and survivors uh, pushed for the media to stop giving credit to the murderers, like stop mentioning their names. And that was actually a huge fear on the 1 year anniversary that they were going to relive it through the story of we still don't know why they did it, rather than look what we went through a year ago.
right.
There was such a concern that they were just going to here we go again. Now we're going to focus on these guys. So there was this push like stop, and it kind of works, and it's carried over to today. Kind of. I mean, we still know their names, but I guess they're not so pronounced as much as they used to be, right?
Well, and I wonder if the evangelical way of saying, like, we're in a battle against good and evil,
Mhm.
where you put, I mean, obviously these acts are the most horrifying, violent, evil things, but then, the humans behind them, like, are there, and I'm not trying to be an apologist because
Mhm.
this keeps happening, but I think that in order for us to stop this, which of
Mhm.
course would be very simple by just enacting gun control laws, but
Yeah.
that takes, an entire government in motion. And I just don't see in our divided government right now that happening,
Yeah.
especially after Sandy Hook, which, you
I
know,
mean, yeah.
if you don't have gun control
Yeah.
after Sandy Hook, then I
What's
don't
going on?
I don't think it's ever going to happen. But there
It's
is,
just those NRA lobbyists do carry so much weight and power. And I ultimately feel if you're a president, you can make an executive order. If there's a natural disaster or a riot, a president makes that executive order, it surpasses the House, it goes by everyone, and you have to do it. So I feel, that was a perfect window for Obama to say, executive order, we're done with assault rifles, right?
yeah,
And perhaps it would get changed later, but at least someone make that step. And it's also interesting to know in 1999, in New York City, there's a case in which a Kendra Webdale is standing on a subway platform and she's pushed and
hmm,
she dies. And they find uh, that the person who did this has psychiatric issues. He's guilty, but it's under insanity, right?
right.
So, because of that, spawned Kendra's Law, which provided court ordered mandatory psychiatric evaluations of those who are sick or have severe mental issues.
Like,
Uh,
you mean the homeless on the streets? Like when they have severe mental issues, they have to be
and they acted
made
out.
homeless.
And they act out. Yeah, it's a court ordered look. You need to get help. So that's interesting that occurs also in this year. If in 1999, uh,
But and I think that's what I was going to go into is because we have such this epidemic of white males mainly doing this,
mhm,
how are we as a society failing our youth in a way?
mhm,
Like what is happening to these individuals that like it's like this weird crucible. Now, like here's the thing. Middle school and high school are extremely difficult times.
yeah,
There's a reason why there's a lot of books and movies and TV shows about the trials and tribulations of middle school and high school kids because you're hormonal, you're going through
yeah.
puberty, you
We hold grudges.
hold grudges, the cliques, like social
Yes,
hierarchies are created. I mean, we are,
yes,
and we are social creatures, which by means that means that there's social hierarchies that
yeah,
have always existed. And how, that was one of the interesting things that we were talking about before we started recording this was a lot of this kind of comes out of the satanic panic of the 80s. So you
Yes.
have, like the shooter video games and violent television and, rock and roll music of the kind that they were listening to, which was like that very hardcore industrial.
Yes.
And the goth movement, like that's the reason why they killed, which you can be definitely
That's the year of
connected.
Marilyn Manson. Marilyn
Yes.
Manson took a lot of blame for this. He was picketed by so many religious groups in every town he played. Also interesting to note, metal detectors. Columbine prompts people to consider and then start utilizing metal detectors in schools. And then following the tragedy, little kids and kids in general are starting to get in trouble or suspended for what would be considered like funny little weird things. But for instance, a second grader, was suspended for using a chicken tender as a gun, like pretending that a chicken tender that he was holding was a gun.
Right.
Suspended. A first grader made a paper gun playing cops and robbers. Suspended.
Right.
And then it just becomes this big scare. It's the satanic scare, right? And now it's with kids and guns. Like, what are you doing? You got to stop. Like, this is just a thing. And
Well,
heavy metal, Marilyn Manson.
Well, for that, the metal detectors, it's an overcorrection, but it's almost like you are correcting the symptom, but you're not getting into the disease, which is
right.
the alienation of certain types of kids in high schools, right? So, it's so interesting because it's my 30th year reunion this year, high
Oh,
school
wow.
reunion, which is kind of insane. And we had video cameras back there. And so just today on Facebook, there was I think it was our class president or somebody posted this video from our senior day, where they like shipped us off to kind of this I think it was called Holiday Hill. It was a like one of those, it had a pool, it had a lake, it had courts, played
right.
basketball. And so he posted like a 30-minute video, and it was interesting of the people that were focused on, which were, again, I came from a high school that was probably very similar to Columbine minus all the evangelicals. And so, they had the popular kids, which was the clique, which was the football players and the basketball players and the lacrosse players. And so in this video, you see all the popular kids, and then you see flashes of everybody else. And the crew that I always kind of connected to the Trenchcoat Mafia, there was not one picture of them in there. And so it's how do you not exclude people who might be different, right? And I think what we were speaking about earlier is I think art is very important to be able to safely work through issues of rage and anger and disappointments and violence because it's safe, it's creative, and you can get all of those feelings out because as human creatures and individuals, we do have that in us, right? But how is there a way that we can create support systems within a social hierarchy to catch kids? And of course, there's mental illnesses as well. But like if a kid is feeling like he belongs in some way, is that an answer then? The belonging. And then also you have to talk about the misogyny in this as well. And of course, we've been dealing with the repercussions of that. You mentioned Marilyn Manson. There's, many, many articles about how misogynistic and what he has done to his past girlfriends. We have the Me Too movement. The kid who shot up everybody in Santa Barbara, especially the girls, because he couldn't get a date. I think the toxic masculinity and boys feeling they have a right to girls' bodies goes much deeper into our culture with what we are showing on TV, what we are showing our politicians doing. Like I don't know, it's like this weird last gasps of this time period where everything seems to have been going wrong as far as how we live as a community together. And
Yeah.
then you have these explosions of rage because we're one of the only countries where an 18-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old can get semi-automatic weapons. So they
Easily.
can do the most amount of damage in a short period of time. Because even if, like, you know, in the olden days, like if you had gotten a shotgun, there's, I guess, a lot. I think Canada has the most amount of guns out of all of the other countries outside of the United States. And that's because everybody hunts. But if you
Hmm.
had a shotgun, which you have to like reload, I don't know anything about guns,
Sure. A
but if you have
rifle.
a rifle, like if you have to reload after
Yeah.
each bullet or each second bullet, somebody's going to have enough time to like take you out to essentially immobilize you. Whereas with a semi-automatic weapon, it's trying to cause the most amount of damage in the least amount of time. And
Yeah.
I don't see any sort of reasoning why that should have any citizen have access to that. That is
But
not a
by all accounts, if you are a hunter and you're, you know, I really like the hunters that are actually eating the meat, you know, rather than for the thrill
sport, right?
or their trophy. They don't use. It's never even. They know there's no reason to use an assault rifle to go, say, deer hunting. Uh, it just it makes no sense. And going back to you're talking about art at this time. You know, I think that's why the grunge movement was so successful, right? Because it was a response to pop music and the end of the Reagan era and like Bush Senior and
Yeah.
what is this? So there was this angst too. But then, you know, there's that old adage, I went through the same thing and we didn't do this. You know, you have some of these, I guess, baby boomers, right? Who
Right.
have this tough, like you dealt with it. Of course, everyone gets bullied, but you just got used to it. You do your thing, you move on, you fight back, you stand up for yourself. And that's just the
Well,
way you did it. And, you know, so if that is true, if we follow that logic, and now these are the same people who say, everyone's so sensitive, you need your safe space. It's if we follow that logic, where does that leave us? Like, I don't understand.
well, I actually have a theory about trauma. So I don't think
Like, is that true? I was just going to ask. I'm sorry. If we follow that logic, do you think that's true? That something happened over time, which made people really susceptible, really angry towards bullying?
No, because again, and this is where I was going to say my theory. So
Yeah.
the heyday of the serial killer in
Mhm.
Western society. This is my own personal theory, and I have actually read about this in several places. Was in the 70s and early 80s. Now,
Yeah.
those men
Yeah.
came, which is the baby boomer generation,
Yeah.
came from parents, fathers who had fought in World War II and had
Right.
seen the most horrors of all horrors of humankind that have ever been essentially perpetrated by humankind. So you have all these completely traumatized PTSD men coming
Before they knew it
home.
was PTSD, by the way.
What was that?
I believe that was even before they labeled it
Oh,
PTSD.
they called it shell
Way
shock
before.
back then. Yeah, no, they
Yeah.
called it shell shock. So you have all
Yeah.
these dads coming back with severe
Yeah.
shell shock,
Yeah.
completely twisted by the things that they had seen in the war. And all of that trauma and violence that they had seen went on to their families. Now, their
Mhm.
families, boys, got, completely traumatized by this intergenerational trauma. And you had the serial killer started
Yeah.
showing up. And I think it was like the late 60s, 70s. And that was like the heyday of the most serial killers working at a certain time. And so now you have, you had Vietnam in the early 70s. So I personally believe violence begets violence.
Mhm.
And then we have a whole discussion about the paramilitary culture that
Yeah.
started happening in the 80s with, and again, I don't want to say it's just Rambo with like, the big gun.
Militias.
But you have the militias, and the United States has always had a very strong militia underground.
Yeah. Yeah.
of people wanting to live off the grid and feeling like the Second Amendment was the fact that there should always be a citizen militia. But this kind of um, fetishization of guns started. And, this is again where the semi automatic and automatic weapons started showing up in the 80s and 90s. And so now you have these disenfranchised, intergenerational trauma, uh,
Yeah.
trigger happy boys who have a lot of rage, puberty hits. They feel like they deserve women's bodies and they're not getting them because the girls are like, ooh, you're weird. I'm feeling some energy coming off of you. And then they have access to weapons of mass destruction, essentially. I mean,
Yeah.
if you can take out like 12 people in one room in 4 minutes, like that's
Yeah.
it's almost kind of like a perfect storm. And, the not wanting to get political on this podcast, but there's certain parts of our political society saying, well, it's all mental health. And I think that that is a cop out because yes, it is mental health, but it is also then the proliferation of guns in our society where there's a very small population that have like entire stockpiles for a militia, like these kids had in their basement. And then you have online, which again there's so much coming out of Silicon Valley now, as far as ethicists talking about what social media and the internet is doing to our brains and how we're in this very big social experiment that we are not prepared for. And this is interesting to note that in 1999, there was AOL, there was chat rooms where all
Napster was shut down in 1999 instantly.
What was that?
Napster was shut down officially in 1999.
Yeah, but you had the AOL and you had I think MySpace. Didn't these boys have MySpace?
Amazon starts in 99 too. So online shopping really AOL. Now there's like a lot of e-commerce. There's like a huge .com explosion. There's so much going on. Oh, another thing I wanted to say is from Columbine came a difference in police training, where now it's officers are being taught to go in. Like you, whenever there's a shooting, something's going to happen. You have to go in. You cannot wait. Because you're a cop, right? And that's you're there to protect, especially children. And there have been instances, future and meaning recently, where shootings have happened and they don't intervene as they're supposed to. Like that was supposed to be a change. And I don't know. It happens case to case, I guess, or event to event. But that was another thing that, came from Columbine was this need to figure out a new way of training and dealing with situations like this.
Right. Well, and then also, even though that happens, what we saw at the Uvalde shooting, they didn't go in for half an hour, 40 minutes.
Right.
Now they were, I believe the sheriff was, I don't know if it was sheriff or whoever the head of police was fired. But even so, I think because we know how this plays out, even the cops are like, well, I don't want to go in there.
Right.
And
I mean, these days, the climate is such that it's easier for an officer to pull over an African-American with a broken headlight and shoot them, right, as they're running away or resisting arrest, than it is to go into a school where you're hearing assault rifles go off. It's just safer. It's easier. You can always say there was a threat. And that's what's always weird, right? In those situations, you'll hear them say, it was a threat. I felt threatened. He was reaching for his pocket, even though it was a cell phone. I didn't know if it was going to be a weapon. Columbine, another school shootings, you hear all that and it's just like, where's it coming from? Am I going to be next? So there's just a difference in protection. There's a protection of self for these officers, or so they say they feel threatened. And then in situations where they should not feel threatened and they feel strong and they're going to protect their community, they kind of back out and they hesitate.
Yeah. No, No,
I
so,
believe it's that military culture. You're 100% with that. These Vietnam really messed with a lot of lives. It also uh,
well, I think every war did. And now we are, of
abuse.
course, now coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, we're seeing it
We have,
again.
we have these war every 20 years, seems
Yeah,
like. We go into a major war and then we don't really have very good support for the veterans, and that violence just goes into their communities. And again, I'm not saying that um, Columbine was because of the Vietnam War. But what I'm saying is that we as a society seem to be moving in increments towards
right.
certain things. And the fact that I think at this point, we have a mass shooting here in the United States every 10 days. Um,
We have 576 militias presently in the United States.
and so it's kind of interesting for the people that live in the United States because you
Yeah.
don't think about it that way. It's like, oh, well, you have other countries that are dangerous. And my best friend right now is in Turkey. And she
Mm-hmm.
was talking to a half Turkish, half American woman. She was like, I'm very afraid to go to the United States. They have all the guns there. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking to myself, but you're in Turkey.
You're in
Like,
Turkey.
what? And
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah.
interesting to hear, like, when you say, like, we have a mass murder every 10 days at this point,
Mm-hmm.
that's the statistic. And a mass
Mm-hmm.
murder is 3 or more dead.
3 or more? Okay.
Of course, it's typically by shootings. And I think in the last like 5-6 months, I don't know, after COVID, things have gotten a little crazy because being a crime writer, I'm always looking at different crime stories on the internet. And there's literally like 8 people found dead in this house, 7 people
So
found
much.
dead in this house. And that's literally like within a day of each other. And so I think probably that statistic might even be a little older because we have a gun epidemic in this country and we have people
Yeah.
shooting a lot of people, and a lot of times it's men and it's white men. And
Speaking of which, I just wanted to throw in there Eileen Wuornos, who killed 7 men, during an interview said, I'm not a serial killer, I'm a murderer. So I thought that was really interesting, right? Even though
yeah,
she's killed 7, it's just these minds, right? These deviant minds. They're sociopaths. They have no empathy, and they have at their disposal different weapons. I mean, it's accessible. If you're a nurse and you're working in a hospital, you want to drug people and kill them. It's accessible. Everything seems to be right there, and you have your ways of taking out your anger and your mistrust in people and your trauma out on so many different people.
yeah, yeah. So Columbine, was again the first of so very, very many. And it wasn't the
Yeah.
first. I mean, there had been university shootings before, but in this common era with the semi-automatic weapons and our media appetite,
Mm-hmm.
these shooters, they say also that these shooters come in threes, which is another reason why the media has really tried hard to stop naming and
Mm-hmm.
kind of putting their pictures and who they are
Right.
all over, because the ones who are kind of on the fence are of a sudden like, yeah, I want that. I want to have the relevance. I want to have the importance. I want to be somebody. And
Sure.
this is the way I'm going to be. But what's fascinating is that when Brian Koberger was arrested, they did the exact opposite. His face
Yes.
was everywhere. Like if you
Yes.
look up that case, you have him looking, you have him screaming in the car, you have, his writings. Like it's so the media is still doing that.
Yeah.
And we as the audience
Mm-hmm.
are, because there's so much talk about clickbait articles at this point in time. And
Yeah.
we're clicking on those articles and we're reading about, oh, who's this new deviant mind? Because we do have a fascination with these people.
Yes.
But I don't know how we can change that. And again, it comes back to like, hurt people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a way that we can get these people help? Now, to be fair, both the Harris and the Klebold's, the Harrises did try to get their son help. He was
Yes.
going to a psychiatrist. He was, he was
He was on
diagnosed.
the drugs,
He
yeah,
was
on
on the
the
drugs.
pharmaceuticals, yeah.
But there is, and I don't know if it's changed now since Columbine, because again, First Amendment rights. But if you have your buddy and his parents saying, "Hey, I came, we went to the police station and said we were doxxed, and he's trying to get people to kill me."
Mhm,
Outside of a restraining order, what can I do? And
mhm,
this goes into also with stalking. Like if a
mhm.
woman has a person who's stalking her,
Absolutely.
side of having a restraining order, they can't do anything. They can't arrest that person. And so
Mhm.
I don't know where it falls down to
And
because
often it means nothing. In those cases, it actually the stalker just keeps at it.
well, he exactly, but that's what I'm saying is like if
Yeah,
like I don't know personally, and I'm thinking out loud, is
right.
what would the sheriff's department have been able to do with putting Eric Harris on a list that they were now watching?
Mhm.
Because that makes me very uncomfortable because I come from a communist country and there was lots of lists and a lot of people were being watched
Sure.
by the police and the government. And so I don't want to live in a society that has lists of people that are being watched at all times
It's
because
case
again,
to case.
we live in a
It's really
democracy. So I don't
yeah,
I have very like, I've been on the other side where because I did live in a communist country, I know how that works.
right.
And so it's frightening to me. So I don't actually know what the answer is what the sheriff's department could have done outside of maybe finding probable cause to find all that weaponry. Now, if they had been able to
Yes.
find that weaponry, then maybe, they could have but again, this goes into gun control laws. If you find a minor with a stockpile of weapons, what happens to them outside of their guns being taken away?
I mean, you have a pipe bomb go off in the neighborhood. They don't know who did it. Then you have kids coming forward. I think I know who did it. The cops ought to do something, but they don't do anything. So why is that? And also, it's it is a lot of this influence, and it comes back to these militias that they create their own communities, and then they have this feeling that that's their own community, they get to protect their community. But going back to First Amendment, a lot of the material and a lot of the propaganda that they wrote were passing out. They had newsletters. You know, I feel it's case to case at that time, and maybe even still today, who the authorities are going to follow. Like, really, who's a red flag? These days, it's easier, right? Because we have the Patriot Act, which incidentally just keeps getting renewed every year by every president. Not every year, but whenever it's up in 4 years, which enables authorities to listen in on conversations. Oh my God, they're talking about this. Now we have all this information on you.
And
You're being
again, I have I don't know if I have strong feelings, but I'm always very weary about things like the Patriot Act because even
absolutely
though it's meant for good, because you want to root out people who aren't doing good things,
right.
at the same time, if the politics change or if the religion changes or if somebody has a vendetta against somebody, because after all, we're talking about people and people are spiteful and
Yeah.
nasty. And when you give power like that to an organization or a government, then we're only as good as the government. And if
Hmm.
we all of a sudden don't trust the government, then what's going to happen? Again,
Yeah.
not wanting to go into the politics, but there have definitely been very like certain presidents that I was terrified of having the Patriot Act because, they were vengeful and
Hmm.
they wanted to go after their um who they saw as their enemy, which
Hmm.
in a democratic country, that's very difficult to see because,
Hmm.
again, coming from a communist country,
Yeah.
that was the way that they kept power over their citizenry. So it's like I have this weird background where
Sure.
I've seen how wrong that can go. And so I understand why they did the Patriot Act. But at the same
Mhm.
time, there were a lot of people that were targeted for the color of their skin or where they were from.
But you also don't need it now, and that's just what confuses me is
Well, power. Once
it's
you
the
give
power to
power,
be
you're
able
not giving
to.
it back. Like you
Uh,
don't want to give it back.
so yeah, let's going back to after Columbine, as I think I mentioned on the last episode. that morning, we dropped 78 bombs on Kosovo. Kosovo lasted 78 days. Clinton makes the announcement about it, this biggest strike, knocked down a hospital, knocked down a school. So many civilians and children's lives were lost, by the way, in those 78 days. And an hour later, he's talking about teenagers. They're too influenced by violence. So it's just so crazy, the notion that you can get up there and say, oh, teens and violence, and you're dropping 78 bombs and just killing so many people. And then you take it a step further. This is the year of Lewinsky, right? So the day that she's to testify, he bombs a Sudan aspirin factory, thinking that it was a place where they were making bombs. And so that pulls the attention away, right? Everything is about pulling attention away. It's just, it didn't work with Columbine. Like there were just so many unanswered questions and things that we didn't know. We didn't know. It would have maybe helped if we had better mental health and counselors at the time to figure out what's going on with the survivors. But then over time, you start to see it. So that's a positive, right? Because now we take bullying way more seriously now. Like it's kind of like a reaction to that thought that like, oh, pick yourself up, move on, like be a toughie, like who cares about bullying, you know?
Yeah, I know. Again, it's just, and this is kind of like a depressing episode, and we promise we'll have a not more interesting, but a less fraught with all the issues of our day episode next episode. But it just made me think of, I was so upset to find out that our daughter's school, they were doing shooting drills, but they can't tell the young kids that they're shooting drills. And so they tell them, I don't know what they actually tell them, why they have to hide in closets or lock the door. But, I was really upset about that. And then I remembered like living in Texas. And again, we were getting under our desks for the nuclear bomb because we were in the Cold War at that point in time.
Right.
It's like, oh, so if the Russians drop the nukes on us, get under your desk.
Yeah, that'll help you.
And it just kind of,
it helped the kids in Chernobyl, didn't it?
Right. Yeah, right. But so, that wasn't a nuclear bomb in Chernobyl, but
yeah.
But at the same time, I just think we live in such a violent society. I'm not sure.
Right.
What can be done.
Hiroshima, like it's just kind of endless, the destruction, mass killings of Indians. The NRA holds a huge conference in Denver about a month after Columbine happens. Everyone just don't do it now. But they want to. Charlton Heston's like, I got to do this. And that's where he gives the over my cold, dead hands speech. And from there, they're able to go, they just keep going on this crusade about these are their rights. I have to just run down very quickly what 1999 looked like for our listeners right now. Okay. JFK Jr. died in that year. Putin became the prime minister, and Yeltsin said, boy, this guy has a bright future. Yeltsin resigns, and thus begins Putin's power. The Blair Witch Project came out. Matrix came out, which our shooters obviously loved and saw. Bill Gates gets in trouble and goes on trial for having a monopoly because of Microsoft. Bush becomes president. There's the Y2K threat. Oh my God, this is going to happen. And then the religious organizations come out and they say the Antichrist is going to appear on the Y2K. And that's why all that's going to happen. Then you have The Sopranos. Eminem's mom tries to sue him for $11 million. She only gets $1,000. So now we're hearing all this new music. It's like pop. It's like a reaction to goth. And like now we're going to bring back La Vida Loca is like a huge hit. Right. So like in terms of pop culture, like there are all these like Jenny Jones's show is found liable of that case where the gay guest comes on and says, I have a crush on this heterosexual guy. Yes. And so the heterosexual guy winds up killing his gay friend. So Jenny Jones is found, the show is found liable. Woodstock 99, a catastrophe. Limp Bizkit comes on, everyone starts destroying things, there are fires. Absolutely Just a horrible idea. The introduction of the euro, which is interesting. I completely forgot about that. Then we have the whole Lewinsky case. And then, I don't know if you remember this, Raft Boy, as it called, Elian Gonzalez, who was put on a raft with a couple of other guys from Cuba to have a better life and go meet his uncle in Florida. So
Oh,
something happens during treacherous waters. Do you remember this? And then they found him. He survived. He's living with his uncle. But Castro's like, this is unacceptable. Like, we want him back. And so we start fighting with Cuba. And then we just send in the FBI, like over 300 people to raid the family house, pull him out, and just ship him back to Cuba. So that was a crazy incident that happened. Yeah, I mean, 1999 was just like a really weird, crazy year. There was like so much going on that the climate is just like, I guess it all came to a head. Like, I feel, obviously, of all the events that occurred that year, Columbine just really made such a mark that it continues to this day. You know, and I guess so does Putin. But in terms of violence and murder, it just really, we had never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
You know, so you have all these other things going on, right, that distract us. You know, the Lewinsky Clinton was a huge distraction, but it all stopped once it was literally, you know, and that was when CNN was every day, we're going to show you this.
Wasn't that the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle?
Yes.
That was, I think, a big, you know, they need to fill 24 hours of stuff to say versus just having the nightly news, which was filtered. And so I think that is.
And also Waco. The Waco coverage was pretty much 24/7 as well. Yeah. And that was long.
Yeah, I remember that as well. No, so it's, so I don't know if, we have gleaned anything from our experience of the last 23 years. Obviously, as we said, they have mass murder shootings every couple of days now. And this was a really depressing, awful case to do because we're still actively in it. And I don't see how, you know, there's been so many people who have tried to make things stick, you know, like the Sandy Hook parents, lobbying Congress and the Senate for gun rights. And I'm glad that they went after that guy who was saying that was like, what are those actors?
Oh yeah, that it was
like we don't even want to give him. Well, we're not going to give him airtime. But
did his mother, the Newtown shooter's mother, also was arrested because she had something to do with his access to the guns?
I don't actually remember because that was so horrifying. I couldn't quite.
I mean, so that's the thing about all this too, is like how, you know, sometimes you don't have the control. Obviously, in a lot of these situations, Bundy, Son of Sam, you have like these, or Eileen Wuornos, you have these instances of abuse, right? The horrible backgrounds. We were kind of talking about how like it wasn't that bad. Sure, it was like mostly socially related, but in terms of family, no signs, right?
Right.
So I think that's also the other thing that we learned from this is like, it doesn't matter. You're going to be vilified because you're related. You're the parent of a monster, right? Yeah. So we always vilify them. You know, John Benet Ramsey's missing. We got to vilify the family. Like before you even realize or consider their innocence, it's just like immediate, like, how dare you? And these, you know, they receive death threats. You know, and you have Eric Harris's father calling like, I think my son is doing this.
Yeah.
And then you have Klebold's mom just like, I'm going to be the only one to talk, you know, and speak up for parents who have, you know, psychotic, sociopathic children, you know?
Yeah. It's
terrible all around. I just think we forget about that. It's so easy. I mean, again, it's case to case. It depends. But if the parents are, you know, they don't know. You know, you want to give your kid privacy, but you don't know what they're looking at on the internet. You don't know what they're doing in the basement. And you want to give them, you know, you want to back off.
Well, because you want to give them, you want to hope that your kid is a good kid and you give them trust.
Right.
Then, again, especially now, the social media, and this is like a very well documented,
Mhm.
YouTube is being, their algorithms, as well
Yeah.
as Facebook algorithms, they are for most attention clicks. Most
Yeah.
attention clicks are the things that are violent and aggressive. And the way that
Yeah.
the algorithm works at YouTube, there is a huge amount of white males getting, what is it called? They are getting indoctrinated into this rage,
Yes.
white nationalist sort of thing. And so, again, we're hacking our brains and we don't know how. Like, we have given so much over to Silicon Valley, to social media companies,
Yeah.
but we're like one big, right now, psychological experiment. And there's ethicists coming out of Stanford being like, yeah, there's so many ethical issues going on here that we just don't know what's going to happen with our brains. So I'm not saying there's one thing that causes school shootings, but I
Mhm.
think that in the culture that we're currently living in, we're
Yes.
in a crucible where before we had like the Ted Bundys, we now have the mass shooter.
Right.
And they're both evil and awful, but they were created in some way. And like, we as a society have to figure out, like, well, how can we stop this? Because here's the thing, there's a lot of people who are born with psychopathic tendencies, and it really
Absolutely.
depends on their environment.
Nature nurture.
That they either become a serial killer or a CEO. Most
Yeah.
CEOs in America are on the psychopathology or sociopathology scale.
And
But
over
they
70% of women receive the abuse and anger online on social media from the men.
Right. So it's like, what can we do as a society? And right now I just feel like we're flailing and everything's kind of imploding.
The funny thing is that when you step back, social media isn't really that social.
No, most
Right?
people are just like yelling into the void.
Yeah. Yeah. Social media is not even social.
So, whereas if you have face to face of togetherness, all of a sudden you're like, oh, hey, you're kind of like me. You're a
Yeah.
human. You have feelings.
Yeah.
The art of communication is definitely something that we need to work on. But I think at this point, we're done with Columbine.
Yes.
Thank you for sticking with us.
Yes.
And
And subscribe. Hey,
subscribe.
listeners, subscribe, tell your friends,
Review. We're going to try to be
review,
better on social media.
leave us comments. How do you think that we can better things?
Right.
So what's the solution?
And let us know. Maybe, we haven't figured out a solution for school shootings, but maybe, I don't know. Let us know what you guys think, because this is definitely something that hits every part of society here in the United States. And it's extremely scary being a parent, and you don't want to like necessarily hide your head in the sand because it's happening. But there's also this sense of like, oh my gosh, what can we possibly do? So we are going to have much more lighter. I mean, there's still going to be murder, but
Yeah.
kind of lighter case. We're going to do 2 cases actually next week,
Yes.
and they're
very excited.
they're very similar. So you guys have a great day, and we'll see you next week. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, Book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read the police found your body in a creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.